Hey everyone, good morning. All right, I hope you all gotten at least some rest. I don't know, was yesterday like a crazy party night or was it the night before? I just arrived last night, so I'm still not in the loop with all of that. But I hope you're all caffeinated and ready for the day. All right, so the theme of this conference, as you all know, of course, you can read, is The Future is Bright. So I thought about speaking about and maybe putting into question that very proposition. Does the future look bright? And how do we know? And can we know? And all of these other philosophical questions that we can ask about a concept as elusive as the future. So how about we start with I want to hear just a little bit from you at the very beginning. What is and there's no wrong and right answers on this one, so feel free to tell me. Can a couple of people tell me what is your general perception? Are we currently living in good times, or are we living in bad times, or really catastrophically bad times? And what is your kind of view of the, let's say, upcoming future, like the next few decades, not like thousands of years away? What would you say? So can somebody tell me? Of course, I'm looking forward to hearing very different opinions, so don't be afraid. Yeah, please.
Thank you, and hello.
Hi.
We are living right now in the era where we can fully live as we imagined. And this is the best era for us, and I'm sure that the much more better is coming. So this is the era of realization of our wishes, our values, following our values, and do something which is beyond imagination. So this is the greatest era, I think.
Okay.
Much more better is also.
Okay, so we're starting off with full-on optimism for the future. That's good to hear. Now, somebody else here maybe have a different view? Okay, tell me. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't see where Anastasia was with the microphone.
Well, actually, it depends on who you're asking. So,
okay.
When you take a look to the global statistics, okay, we are in the better times. But if you ask for a Ukrainian person, or if you're asked to a Lebanese person, like they used to be way better in the 1960s, or the Ukrainians has to be better before the wars. And we know there's a tension between the USA and China, and also in the Pacific region. So it might be create a war that we can see a really bad future, but we don't know it. And statistics say so, will not going to happen. So when we take a look, yeah, of course we are too much away from the Second World War. Now we have more welfare as a quality of life, but I cannot totally say I am seeing the future is totally bright.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a fair point, and obviously you kind of drove it to the point with the fact that it's not the same where you are from, and obviously if you're Ukrainian, you're not looking at statistics and saying woohoo right now. You have bigger problems than that, right? But altogether, right, like on a kind of like on a global scale, with everything that's happening that's also bad. We know that bad stuff is happening. I mean, you mentioned tensions in the Pacific and the tensions between China and the US, but like, you know, tensions between big powers has been a thing since big powers have been a thing, and it will be a thing probably forever if we kind of take into account human psychology. But okay, good. Someone else? I saw some few. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much. I do agree with the wars because the world order is changing. That's why we're seeing lots of wars and proxy wars in different points of the world and different points of our lives. But also, I do believe we are in the best moment of the history that we have ever been, because less and less people die of hunger than they die of overeating, and you know the statistics and the usual thing that we see. And now people actually have the time to think of their identity, of who they are as a person. They have time to actually identify as something other than what we have identified throughout the whole history. That is good, because right now, even though mental health is in decline and all of that, we actually have time to think of ourselves as individuals rather than think of what to do next, of how to win a bread, of how to survive as a family, as a collectivist society. That's why I do think the future does look bright. if we ignore all of the global things that are happening, but they have to happen because throughout the history, those periods had to happen in order for the future, for the days yet to come to look brighter.
Okay, do you mean that in a way they had to happen as in it was kind of predestined to happen, or in a way that like, oh, que sera, sera, what happened has happened and that's it? In what way do you mean?
Both of those things, because if we look at the First World War and then the Second World War, all of those things happened because people were not okay and countries were not okay of how they were living and where they were at that point in time. Now as well, now we see the Ukrainian problem, now we see all of these problems because one country or another country was not okay with what is it right now, the world order, right? So that's why those tiny little wars, not to mention it as they like, not world wars, tiny little things, conflicts had to happen for countries to establish themselves and for individuals to just say, okay, time to move forward, time to create something else, time to just move on from this violations and violence in general.
Okay, very good. Yeah, some of the stuff you mentioned we'll get back to a little bit later. I find it very interesting that you mentioned the mental health thing. That's a very interesting thing to talk about today because it's something where it seems like we are at a kind of a low point. But then again, we also have to take into account that people used to keep all of this to themselves. It's just like when you increase, for example, the availability of cancer screenings, one of the results of that will be that you will have statistically more people in the books that have cancer because you have screened more, and ultimately that did something better and saved their lives probably, but you see it more, right? So with mental health, it's a tough one. I think we are kind of in a tough period with that, but it's also something that people did not talk about openly 30, 40 years ago, especially not before that. And now we are. And maybe some people are even taking it a step too far and making it trendy. You go into TikTok and there's 50 Zoomers pretending to have multiple personality disorder and stuff like that. Okay, so yeah, we said that there is obviously a bunch of kind of weird, bad stuff happening, from the very obvious, like war in Europe, something that we thought was pretty much ruled out, at least since the 2000s, but it has not been, obviously. We have a rise of populism, both on the left and the right, but more on the right at this moment. Case in point, we are in Hungary. Those of you who know what has happened, what's been happening in Hungary in the past, let's say, couple of decades, know that there's certain pretty big problems that have to do with democratic backsliding, with a country like Hungary, which has had very good economic reforms and relatively good standard of living, many things like that, but rule of law is not exactly at its best right now because of the way that Viktor Orban governs, right? Okay, but I don't want to get deported, so let's move on from him. And obviously Trump, right? The whole thing with Trump. I mean, I think we're all sick of talking about Trump at this point. It's been so long since 2016, but we have to, he can be president again, and he, I would argue, is more dangerous now than he ever has been because of the stuff we know that happened in his first term, and what happened, but more importantly, what happened when his first term ended, and how scandalous his approach to not accepting his election loss was for American democracy. But that's a whole other can of worms. Okay, so we said, we heard in this kind of short discussion at the beginning, we heard some very optimistic views, we heard some skeptics who say, yes, maybe we have statistics, but look, there's war, there's this, there's that. So it kind of probably seems like this to you as well, like it's going up and down, like, from one moment you think, okay, stuff is looking good, COVID kind of starts to go down, and then bam, the war in Ukraine starts, So it's kind of up and down. Reminded me of this, I don't know which ones of you know this meme with we're so back and it's so over. It's like this kind of cycle that repeats where you're kind of super optimistic and stuff is going great, and then after that you're kind of like, oh, something bad happens and you think, okay, it's over, everything is horrible. So we kind of tend to kind of sway on that because again, perception of the time we live in and perception of the future is a tricky thing. It's a subjective thing even if we are rational and we take so much data into account and all of that, right? So I propose let's start with talking a little bit about how we view history. So is history like an objective thing that's like there, and like have any of you thought about this like philosophically? Like, are there laws of history? Is there, when I say laws of history, let me explain what I mean. Are some things predetermined to happen, or meaning that then we could potentially actually predict exactly what will happen? Or is it completely random? Or is it that we have free will and then we change what can happen and so on? Or is it, people like to say history always repeats itself. Quote, that Marx quote, yeah, history always repeats itself, first as farce and then as tragedy. I think that's the quote, I'm not sure. So yeah, do any of you have you ever thought about that? Do you think is history cyclical? Is it linear? Is it progressive? Is it like are we bound to keep getting better and better and better and better into infinity? Yeah, Marco.
So, in my opinion, what's going on? I think people do have free will and they influence the outcomes of history, but we should not forget the fact that it's usually been those moments that really shape how history will progress. If we take a look at the birth of classical liberalism, for example, there was always a small amount of people who conceived that idea and then made change on a much bigger scale because of their actual action and free will. So I don't think it's predetermined. It's what people with free will who are willing to act on it influence other people. So the whole society, in a wider sense, can progress. And if we take a microscopic look at the bigger picture, we can see that it's usually been a history of progress so far, and it would be good if it continues that way. It can only continue if people get.
What do you mean when you say usually? I mean, it either is constantly getting better or it's not.
Like I said, when you look at the
or is it this? Or is it this? Is it like?
If you look at the bigger picture, if you look at the past 2,000 years, it's usually a linearly progressive stuff, but not because it was predetermined. It's because people who had good ideas and put them to good use made that happen.
Okay, by the way, guys, I know Marco, this is why I'm like asking him, kind of picking his brains. Don't be scared to ask questions, because I'm not going to like test you like him. But wait, Marco, I have to challenge you for one more thing. Okay, so what about like in ancient times, we had ancient Greek democracy, and we had the certain periods of the Roman Republic where it was very enlightened, and especially the classical period in ancient Greece. And then after that came hundreds of years of Christian and I mean, we're talking about Europe at this stage of Christian kind of very dark thinking until the Renaissance kind of comes up and tries to revive the spirit. So how is that constant progress though? How does that fit in?
The Renaissance put those ideas and even developed them and made them even brought them to another level. So yes, in the Middle Ages, it was a time of rigors. They don't call them Dark Ages for nothing. But when
people actually don't like that term anymore because it kind of simplifies the Middle Ages, because it's not like all cartoonishly horrible, but it's definitely culturally a downgrade from ancient Athens for sure. Yeah.
Of course, yeah, and that's a period of history where you can take a little cherry pick that one and say, okay, this is the only part of history where you have like a constant downfall for a couple of centuries. But even then, you had like people who, after the Middle Ages, during the Renaissance, during the Enlightenment period, brought those ideas from the ancient Greek philosophy, the philosophies of flourishing, and brought them to another level, and that was basically the birth of modern society.
Okay. We had someone else over here wanted to say something. Yeah, please.
You brought every civilization up in China, and I want to say China was better, but it's so
I do probably suffer from Eurocentrism a little bit in terms of when talking about this. I'm largely talking about European civilization, but later on you'll see when we move on to data, we of course take into account the whole. I actually have quite a few charts about China, current China, but you're right, of course, absolutely, yeah. China was a much more. I mean, look at the Islamic world. There was a golden age in the Islamic world when it was the center of science and math and different branches of science and also philosophy. But at the time when Europe was not kind of having a very cheerful scientific and artistic moment. But today we see that the Islamic world is, in the terms of Enlightenment values, far behind the West largely. In terms of like those beliefs, right? In terms of the popularity of certain ideas, in terms of where scientific progress is made, right? It's made in the West mostly, but there's of course the world is changing and the world is getting better and it's much more available to everyone everywhere today, thankfully. Okay, I asked this because I'll go over like just a couple of different views of how we can kind of look at history. There's many, but this is just a few of them. So let's maybe start with the one in the middle. Of course, historical materialism, one of the most famous views of, and one of the most famous methodologies for analyzing kind of the logic of history, if you want to call it that, which was Karl Marx, who took, which was devised by Karl Marx, who of course built on the ideas of Hegel, right? I mean, most of you who have done some basic philosophy know that Marx kind of takes Hegel and they like to say flips him on his head, but blah, blah, blah. There's many similarities and so on and so on. But what the core is that, as you can see in the materialist theory of history, how stuff is produced is what matters the most, right? This is the whole economic thing where the mode of production, whether you are a worker in a capitalist factory or you're a serf on your master's farm or you're a slave in ancient Egypt or whatever, is kind of at the core of history. This is how Marxism sees history. Not only Marxism, but it's one example, right? So there's there's this whole economic base, then there's the superstructure, the stuff you build upon it. But the more important thing about this view is that it takes a very, let's say this was kind of a popular thing during the Enlightenment. It takes a kind of an Enlightenment view to crazy extents, where it says that we can scientifically actually predict what's going to happen, right? The whole thing, if you take anything away from how Marxism views history, take this away. Marxism views history as a process with certain rules. Slave-owning societies, when they advanced to a certain point, they necessarily had to, in the Marxist view, evolve into, slave-owning societies into feudalism, feudalism into capitalism, and then, as we all know, what the kind of the whole shebang was with Marxism, is that inevitably, capitalism will collapse and socialism will replace it. Socialism and then communism, whatever. Basically saying, you know, if you read Marx, and this is like one of the easiest things if you want to dunk on a Marxist, this is like one of the easiest things to do. Like literally this guy said, okay, we cracked the riddle of history. This is how it worked. And we basically make a little scientific formula, and he did his little scientific formula and said, okay, so inevitably, just like these other systems have collapsed and been replaced by other ones, the same will happen with capitalism, and in a very specific way, which of course did not happen. You know, that capitalism was going to get worse and worse for the worker, people are going to work more and more for less and less, and there's going to be a global revolution, and that's when, you know, the proletariat takes power. Not only was he wrong, of course, about the whole revolution thing, but he was also wrong about how capitalism will, how it will develop, and he was so obviously wrong also in not being able to predict stuff like the welfare state, right? These like kind of in-between solutions that became pretty much the status quo in the 20th century, right? Where we have free markets, but we have some sort of a social safety net. Now, whether we like that or not, that's a whole other question, right? But the thing is that Marx did not predict any of that. He predicted, you know, capitalism is getting worse and worse, and then socialism. Okay, so then another view we have Karl Popper, who's an amazing 20th century philosopher, one of the greatest. He has one of his, you maybe know him from that paradox of tolerance. That's one of his concepts that people sometimes misrepresent. But here I'm going to just talk a very little bit about the poverty of historicism. This is his book where he attacks the idea of historicism. That's the idea that basically This is going to be a very simplified, of course, version of it, but basically it's what Marx does, but also many, many other people like Hegel and Plato and so on. Basically, historicism is saying we can look at history, we can see patterns, we can figure stuff out, and then we can predict what's going to happen in the future, right? And Popper says that this is complete BS. This is not a valid thing, and that the repercussions of attempting this or believing this have been horrible. And he cites all of the totalitarian societies that rose up in the 20th century, right? Okay, and then we have some views like this cyclical view. For example, some of you have heard of this book, maybe in memes. It's like I've seen it a lot. In that, The Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler, right? And he's one of the many people who espouse this theory that there's the whole decline of civilizations and then rise of civilizations, and that this is kind of a cycle that basically will always keep repeating. And you're either, if you're living in a civilization, which you are obviously, you're either living in the period where it's on the rise or where it's on the fall, right? And of course, people who love this type of stuff are usually on the side that the apocalypse is coming and the West is crumbling and we're all about to die. So those are just a few. All right. So let's kind of look at a little bit of the history of the pessimists. The ones who are more like Spengler, right? Who kind of have been predicting doom and gloom. Now, of course, I'm not going to talk about like religions, right? Because all of them have a pretty dark view of stuff. Not all of them. I'm sure not all of them, but pretty much all of the Abrahamic religions have this view that there's an apocalypse that will come, and that's when at the end of the world. That's when the final judgment, rapture in Christianity, whatever, will happen. And of course, it's going to be fire everywhere and all the sinners will whatever. Some of you will know better than me how to quote those passages from the Bible. Okay, so yeah, we're not looking at those. We're looking at people who have tried to kind of, as social theorists or historians or economists or political scientists or philosophers, kind of predict what's going to happen. Let's look at a few. Okay, the pessimists. That's the world's smallest violin, as you know. Okay, who knows about Malthus? Okay, nice. Okay, so let me see. Someone who hasn't talked yet. You raise your hand, right?
Yes.
So tell me a little bit.
Malthus was an economist. He was basically saying something about overpopulation. That is like while the society is growing, then we're going to have a problem with the production of food, as we also have on the chart. It's commonly from him is like the escaping the Malthusian trap. Something like that. That actually the problem that he was talking about didn't come true because the productivity of the society and the productivity of food, for example, was growing while there was more people because we were innovating in new certain ways. So yeah, he was very pessimistic about the human growth.
Right. So I think the term Malthusian trap and Malthusianism were coined probably after he died. I don't think he was so full of himself to call Yeah. But you're right. Basically, he was like an economist, but not just an economist. He was also he dealt with quite a few different social sciences. And at the end of the 18th century, I think it was like at the end of the very end of the 18th century, he publishes this book where he puts out this main thesis that he's still famous for today, or infamous for today, which basically says, again, not guessing, not based on religion, but based on what he saw as a rational way to, just like Marx saw that there was a rational way to predict what's going to happen. That's the same, Malthus did the same, but for a different thing, right? So what Malthus did was he looked at the data that he had when he had it, right? So he wasn't just making stuff up. And he saw how the population explosion is kind of started. Already at this point, there's more and more people, right? This is kind of the early, the beginning of that jump that we're still living through, right? That jump in world population. And then he looked at how much food is produced, right? And he also looked at how much arable land there is, right? Because land is a finite resource. Many things are not, but land, whether you're building a building on it or having a field and growing corn, is limited on Earth, right? So until, and if ever we go beyond, that's a whole other thing. But it is true that this is a limited resource, and it's kind of logical from the point of view of the 18th century at least, to think, okay, we're going to have a problem here, right? So the amount of arable land is not growing, because that's not how it works, right? But the population is growing drastically. So what's going to happen? Well, he took the numbers and basically crunched the numbers and said, obviously, at one point, which is this kind of crossing point, which is when this, what we call the Malthusian catastrophe happens. The population grows so much, and we reach the maximum of our food production, which is still not enough to feed all of the people who are now living in the world, right? And massive famines will happen, and catastrophes on levels unimaginable. People would be dying of hunger everywhere in the world. It would be like a normal, everyday occurrence. So what happened with that? What happened with that? Come on, did that happen? No, not only did it not happen, it was kind of the complete opposite, right? Imagine, I didn't check it now, so I can only guess, but imagine what the world population was in 1798. What was it? I mean, it was like around 1 billion, I think? Is it? I think. This is a total guess. I'll have to check. Is it? Okay. And today we're over 8 billion, right? So this is quite the difference. And yet we have the same amount of arable land. We're not on a different planet. So why is everybody not starving? What was his mistake? So look, this is a rational guy. Takes numbers, takes some, guesses some stuff. Okay, if this continues the way it is, this is what's going to happen, right? He didn't make it up, right? But he was completely wrong. So what was the problem?
Capital and technology.
True. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
You didn't consider the amount of food increase. So technology and capital investment and general productivity increases meant that you could produce more food with 1 unit of arable land. And actually now we've decreased the amount of arable land we use because we use it more efficiently. So now not only do we have more food, but we also have a surplus of land, which is now, say, rewilded or reforested, totally on every count.
That's it. So both of you said the right thing. You just kind of gave me more details, which is exactly what I wanted. What he took into account is how much food you can produce per, whether it's square meter or whatever unit of area you want to use. And he was using the numbers of 1798 of how much food you can grow on a certain size of land. What he didn't take into account is that human beings are not static. We innovate. We change things. We have technology. We have, and by the way, when we say technology, we don't mean just like your iPhone, right? We mean the stuff also that's been developing for hundreds of years, the different stuff that people use to grow crops more efficiently and so on and so on. So basically, his mistake was, his formula wasn't wrong. It was more that, it was wrong because he didn't include certain factors that would make all of the difference ultimately, right? And those factors are how humans with their minds change what we have with the planet, right? So yes, land is a finite resource on Earth, of course, but our brains have an almost, and our brains working together in civilization and people cooperating for their own self-interest to ultimately better everyone is something that is very hard to predict. Precisely, I mean, to predict exactly how it's going to go. And you can see how even very smart, very educated, I mean, this guy and people like him were probably the most educated people in the world at that point in time, right? So these were not some hicks, right? This wasn't like people who had no idea what was going on. And still they couldn't see it. They couldn't see, kind of beyond the time that they were living in. Some others could, and this is why they're remembered much more fondly today. But, the Malthusian thing is still something talked about today, and it's not like totally dead. It's very, nobody like proudly says I'm a Malthusian, but there's a lot of neo-Malthusianism going around. Speaking of that, some of the friends of Malthus, as I would say. Okay, so 1968, the population bomb. Does anyone know about this one? So, very similar, very, very similar thesis to Malthus, like we've learned nothing. This guy comes out with this pretty short book in 1968 and says basically overpopulation is killing us. Again, we are in this period in the 60s, a period of rapid population growth around the world, especially in what they used to call the third world, right? In places like India and so on. So basically, again, some smarty guy with some smarty calculation comes out and says, if this continues, literally the same, if this continues the way it is, again, not taking into account how humans will change things and how we will increase our productivity and increase how much we can get from one piece of land or whatever, says that basically this is a huge, huge crisis. And by the way, this was like a progressive cause. Like there were many like hippies, like very left-wing people who were very into this, right? This wasn't some like right-wing thing or something. And basically, they made it, the activists who kind of went out and promoted, evangelized this idea, were basically saying we need to tackle this very seriously with policy. Basically, not exactly eugenics, but maybe population control, sterilization, there were even people who were considering, again, this is not some conspiracy theory, like they're putting, things in the water that are turning the frogs gay and stuff like that. But there were legitimate ideas, or people were at least trying to pitch like ideas, maybe, in poor countries where there's a very high birth rate, like India, maybe, you put something in the water that will kind of sterilize maybe half of the population or something like that. Like people were thinking of that as like a progressive idea so that we don't all starve, because that's definitely going to happen. So, again, just as everything else, how much that happened, we'll see that with some charts later. 1972, there's this, some of you might have heard of this. I know I had it in some classes in college. There was this organization, I think it still exists, called the Club of Rome, which is like an NGO, or like a think tank more, I think. A bunch of intellectuals who kind of, publish these policy papers, the type of thing that think tanks do. And they came out with this report, The Limits to Growth. Again, very similar stuff. Population growth, food instability, but with a bigger focus on the environment as well. And very famously in 72, there's a whole list of like what they predicted, again, with scientific models, with analysis on computers, with many pieces of data, with some, common sense kind of stuff. And they said, for example, in 72, I don't remember exactly, I will have to check it, but something on the level of like, by the year 2000, I don't know, like Amsterdam will be completely underwater, for example, right? I don't think Amsterdam was what they said, but like that type of thing, right? You've heard people still talk about this type of thing, right? By the way, when I talk about this as BS, don't take it the wrong way that I'm saying that any sort of global warming doesn't exist, or that that's also BS, right? We have scientific proof. We know at least something's going on, right? The question is in what way and what we do about it. That's a whole other question, right? Like how we deal with it and do we have to deal with it and blah, blah, blah. That's a whole other thing. But So these guys were not wrong to say that, okay, there will be, challenges with the climate change, whatever. But again, their predictions, whenever people try to make these scientific predictions, it fails spectacularly. Absolutely, of course, we have problems with climate change that are a result of probably of climate change today that we didn't have in 1972. But nothing close to those predictions happened. Like, these were apocalyptic predictions, end of the world type stuff, right? And then today, I would say the spirit of Malthus is alive and well with neo-Malthusians of different stripes, but the ones that I kind of like to draw attention to is not the whole eco movement, that would be too much to say that, but one wing of the eco movement, of the green movement, which is kind of the hardcore, some people call them the dark environmentalists. Greta Thunberg, as innocent as she seems, has a very, very dark and gloomy philosophy. And there's this organization called Extinction Rebellion. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, in a bunch of countries. So basically they're like Fridays for Future and stuff like that, but they're like hardcore, and they're saying we're all gonna die in 10 years if we don't do this big list of things that we're saying. It's, it's virtue signaling, it's whatever, and it's theater a little bit, but the core of the idea is this eschatological thing, the end of the world is coming, and young people, the Gen Z people growing up with this and kind of uncritically taking it into account. Imagine, no wonder everybody's anxious. Wouldn't you be anxious if you actually believe that we're all gonna die in 10 years? That like a literal biblical flood is gonna happen? Come on. Again, we're not speaking of dismissing any sort of problems with climate, absolutely not. But these guys are literally saying, you're either going to be a revolutionary for the cause or you're going to die in the big wave in 10 years. I saw, I live in Berlin, and I saw a poster 3 days ago. They had one of these tralala protests, these guys, or was it Fridays for Future, or was it Extinction Rebellion? But they had a poster where it said 20th of September, global climate strike. By the way, does anybody here even know that happened? They do it every few months. It said that the date, right, 20th, people are gonna go in front of the Reichstag building, whatever, global climate strike. And then they had a slogan, a big flashy slogan above that. And the slogan said, I found this completely bizarre. The slogan said, protest like there will be a future. And they're so close to getting it. They're so close, but they're not quite there, they're so close, but still they don't, protest like there is going to be a future. Maybe they realize that their strategy of telling everybody that we're all going to die is not the most smart strategy to grow a social movement, right? But still, I just found that so bizarre. Anyways, this is not, again, indicative of the whole green movement, absolutely not, but there is a wing that is more and more mainstream, maybe less in the last 6 months, 1 year, but there was the whole period where Greta Thunberg was everywhere, where you couldn't get away from her. This type of apocalyptic thinking that kind of over-accentuates, takes confirmation bias and takes it to 100, right? Okay, I know that the climate is changing and that's not good, and then I will take anything that suggests that is true, and that's true, that we're all gonna die in 15 years if we don't do, and then just uncritically taking that in. And to me, what's sad is Malthus wrote that book at the end of the 18th century. People spoke about this in the 60s and the 70s, saying that by the year 2000, this and this and this is gonna, and everybody's gonna die, and we need to sterilize people and whatever, population growth in these poor countries is going to continue, and everybody's going to have 50 children. No, and at what point do you, and still today with the internet, with all of the world's knowledge available to pretty much everybody, as long as you're literate enough to know the difference between a legitimate source and illegitimate source and so on, right? And still, people come out in the thousands and say, we're all going to die in 10 years. So I don't know what that says about us as humans, but it's interesting and it's sad that we don't learn too much from history. I don't think most of these young people know, of course, who Malthus was, but that's the problem. Maybe if they did know who he was, maybe they would know that what their kind of their logic is not new, right? Yes, please.
Yeah, can you hear me well?
Let's wait for the mic. I can't hear you that well, so
First, I'm sorry I'm interrupting this
no problem.
very interesting topic that you're addressing. My question is that throughout the history of humanity, we were also facing different kind of challenges. So these people movements, don't you think that we didn't die, we didn't have this kind of catastrophes because they actually had some impact on technology, or the way policies were developed, or how things were being done? Because
I get-
for instance, in terms of in the climate part, I work on that, and I'm pretty sure that humanity will die like in 30 years due to climate change. But
You think that?
no, I don't.
Oh, you don't. Okay. Good.
But I'm also aware that if we don't change the process that we are and the way that we work as a system and society, there's a lot of people that are going to die. So are these movements that throughout the history set up proof that people think in a catastrophic way, and it's not the reality, but just a way of people expressing the need to address something.
That's a fair point. Did you want to add something? Did you have something else to say, or?
No.
Oh, okay, sorry.
That's the question. I'm sorry. It's not.
No problem, no problem. I totally get your point. I mean, of course that I'm not saying social movements are stupid as a concept. Of course they're not, right? But again, I would think that these guys who uncritically say these apocalyptic things and try to motivate people by fear are ultimately, maybe in the short term, they're gaining popularity. You know, when this exploded, how many people were, it was on the news all the time, and now it's kind of mostly irrelevant. I think it's counterproductive. Just because that logic of, well, their heart is in the right place, right? Like there is a problem with pollution, whatever. There is a problem with what humans, what our advancing technologies are doing to the environment and so on. That's true. But I don't agree with the point of like, oh, their heart is in the right place. Well, no, because there's wrong and right solutions to problems, right? So, for example, let me give you an example. In Germany, the green movement is very strong and quite popular. And as most of you know, Germany has one of the most popular green parties in the world. It's currently in the government, right? In the coalition government of three parties. And they generally are considered one of the major parties in Germany. And the thing is, when the Green movement kind of exploded in the 80s, before it was a political party or anything else, it was tied in very much to these anti-nuclear protests. Think of the time, it was the Cold War, people were always tying nuclear technology to potential warfare and not thinking of peaceful use, blah, blah, blah. So they were, in Germany, the Green movement was heavily against nuclear energy. And today, I mean, today they have not changed their minds. And some of you, I think a few of you must know that Germany very recently decided to decided maybe like 8 years ago, but implemented more recently, to shut down all their nuclear power plants, right? Which is one of the stupidest decisions a country has made. And the logic of that was, again, their heart was in the right place, but their mind wasn't in the right place. We know, of course, we can debate about nuclear energy till tomorrow, right? It's a whole topic that most of us are not knowledgeable about, but we can talk about all of these implications. But we know that nuclear energy is one of the greenest sources of energy. Again, but you have to put things, I see somebody waving their head. We'll talk later in the Q&A as well. But you have to take something into account. Obviously, a solar panel is cleaner than nuclear on a basis of, oh, look at this, right? But we have to take into account how much power something can produce. Nuclear power is, with the current technologies that we have, absolutely the most efficient and the least polluting way. Like, if you've ever seen those images of nuclear power plants with that stuff coming out, does anybody know what that stuff is that's coming out of the top? Well, I didn't hear anything. No, that's an atomic bomb. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about nuclear power plants, and they have those big thingies, and there's like all that smoke. What's that stuff coming out? It's steam. It's literally steam. And of course, if you go into how a nuclear reactor works, it's literally, we have this little element, this little metal thingy that, because of this little magical stuff, radiation that it has, can heat up amazing amounts of water, which then evaporates and moves those turbines inside and generates power, and the rest of the stuff goes out. Of course, there's stuff like nuclear waste that we have to think about, but nuclear waste is nothing compared to the stuff we get with coal. So my point with this was, in Germany, they had a green logic, a logic that comes from the green movement, for green purposes, right? And they switched off the greenest possible effective way to create power, and had to turn on previously decommissioned coal power plants, the dirtiest source of energy.
Because I'm from that academic part, so Germany didn't close the nuclear plants. Germany
Yes, it did.
didn't close the nuclear plants due to the social movement. This is something that is going to be talked about. The fact is that the nuclear plants that were closed were already old, and they couldn't have the renovation necessary to continue to produce energy. So, because they were produced in the same time period. So, it occurred at the same time we were doing. Another thing, the saying that nuclear energy is the greenest source of energy is like academically, it's not correct. I'm not saying it's as bad as some people are painting it, but the thing is, when you start using the climate models to address and evaluate the effects of nuclear energy, there's two ways to do that. We should first ignore the toxic residue of producing energy, nuclear energy. So currently, we do not have the technology to extract the radiation. We think that we will be able to have that technology that is currently being developed in terms of, research centers.
All right, I have to move on because I have too many slides. I would love to talk to you after this some more and to get some more from you, absolutely. But I have to move on because I'm basically at kind of half and I have less than half. No, it's not your fault because we also had an interesting discussion here. I don't think the Germany thing is as far as I know, many of those plants were operational up until last year, or at least a few were operational up until last year. A bunch were shut off again in this period. Of course, the factors that went into this decision are multiple. It's the green movement and it's a fear of a nuclear catastrophe. In Germany, it was triggered by Fukushima. One little thing happens and of course it's bad, whatever, but like people then think that means, that nuclear energy is super, super unsafe. It's not. We'll talk about this, but there's measures how many deaths are the result of 1 unit of energy being produced. And nuclear is very, very low on that. And the problem of nuclear waste is a problem in the sense like something that has to be dealt with. But one nuclear power plant in 10 years produces an amount of nuclear waste that basically fills like one parking lot. If you put it in barrels. And yes, it's radioactive, and yes, you're right, we don't have the technology to make it not radioactive instantly, but this is why we have the solutions that we currently have, which are not perfect, which are like building remote storage areas where this stuff just is put, or underground, right? In secured metal casings, just making, there's safety, we have ways of dealing with this. And the problem of nuclear waste is much smaller than the problem we get from basically any other source of power that is viable and strong enough to be the main power source, which for now, solar and wind are not. They're going to be, I hope, and they're going to keep getting better and better, and that's great. But those are also only backup sources of power. You have to have, you always have to have a gas or coal or nuclear in case, the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. That's not a joke. That's really how it works. So you can't have, imagine a country that runs only on wind energy. That wouldn't be a functioning society. Okay, we have to move on. So let's talk a little bit about the optimists. I don't necessarily, I'm not with this slide saying that Ayn Rand is the representative of this, even though I would say she has a pretty optimistic view of humanity in general. But it's a nice picture of a woman smiling as well. And she looks pretty optimistic with that. This was from her Playboy interview, by the way, which is one of her most legendary interviews. When people used to say that they were buying Playboy for the articles, they weren't always lying. Like that magazine actually had good journalism. Okay, so has anybody heard of this guy or this book? 20th century history is my hint. Okay, so I put this in just to kind of make the point that obviously people who are optimistic can also be completely wrong, right? So this guy publishes a book in 1933 of all years, about how a world war, just like the First World War, which had already happened, of course, by that time, would be impossible. Because the world is so interconnected. This is 1933, and this was, by the way, true. This was kind of like the first wave of globalization in a way, right? In the 1920s, 1930s, the world was much more connected than ever before, and it was kind of revolutionary. Right? So basically what this guy said was, there's so many ties between countries, there's so much trade, there's all of this stuff, it would be completely irrational, it would be basically impossible that a world war anywhere close to the one, to the First World War would happen. And if it happened, it would be very short and not very brutal. And obviously, suddenly, the 1st of September 1939, something happens on the border between Germany and Poland, and the world was never the same, right? It was 6 years of absolute horror. So I just put this in there to show that it's not simple optimists are always right and the pessimists are always wrong. You can very much be wrong in predicting something positive. Okay, but then we have in the Enlightenment, which we mentioned I think earlier, where we had this burst of philosophical thought that was very pro-human, pro-advancement, pro-freedom, pro-human happiness, and not focusing on, some pleasing a greater being in the sky and living our lives in a way which is completely centered around that, but looking at ourselves as kind of the end in itself, right? Man as an end in himself. So since we don't have much time, I have to skip over some of this stuff. Let's go straight to some of the charts. Okay, I have a bunch of them. We're not going to talk about all of them that much, but since we kind of looked at this whole what's happening, what do we perceive as happening, positive, negative, blah, blah, blah. I'm sure most of you, or a lot of you, have seen some of these, but there's this great website, Our World in Data, where you can look at data for so much stuff. You can compare it, you can put in, it's amazing. Okay, so let's look at this one. So this is the share of the population living in extreme poverty by world region since 1987. Of course, if you look at this on a larger scale throughout history, it's a much more dramatic picture, right? If you look at, I think one of the charts here might be that there's that famous hockey stick chart, right? How much people earn per day, based on adjusted for inflation and all of that stuff throughout history, and basically for thousands of years, for basically all of human history, everybody was poor except the king or whatever. And this chart looks like this, and then we get to the 18th century and whoosh, literally a hockey stick like this, and it keeps going up and it's still going up. What happened in the 18th? What happened at that time? Why did it start going up? The Industrial Revolution, right? Like suddenly humans figured out how to be much more productive. It wasn't, the concepts such as division of labor. You don't have to, if you're building a chair, you don't have to build the whole chair. You don't need to spend 3 days, 5 days, whatever, 5 weeks building a chair. You have one guy who does one part of the work, another guy who does another, and you can have a chair in 5 minutes, of course, with the right technology and knowledge. And this explosion of productivity also led to an explosion in human flourishing, right? So here, that's on the larger scale. Here we look at from 87 to now, so okay, it's 2013. And you see that even in the poorest countries, even in the places where it's not great to live, there's a positive trend in the share of people living in extreme poverty. Child labor, for example, this is something that was normal in the 19th century, in parts of the 20th century even. Today is in the West unimaginable, but still exists in some countries, which is horrible. But you see, look, from 2000 to 2016, look at these numbers. This is, again, we're not comparing apples and oranges. We're not comparing, ancient Egypt and today. We're looking at the trend from the year 2000 until 2016, and look at those numbers. Weekly work hours. Okay, this is just a few countries here, but you see, like Western Europe, Switzerland, Italy, Belgium, France, right? From the 1870s to 2000. We not only, are living much better lives in so many ways and can afford things that we could never imagine, and so on. People actually have more time for themselves. Right? And this is not because, somebody did the world revolution and put a law that said that you can only, workers have to work 5 hours or whatever. No, it's because your work on the market is also a commodity, and you are worth something, and your employers, I mean in part with other things of course, but your employers want to, if they want to keep the good people, if you're in a functional market society, right? So we're not talking about like super corrupt places where many other things come into play. Your boss wants, if you're a really good worker, he wants you to stay. He's not going to give you the most horrible, office environment and where you have to sit all day or whatever. Okay, even something this ridiculous. Do you know that we're taller today than humans have pretty much ever been? Yeah, it's literally, it has to do with nutrients. Humans, for most of history, were starving. And when they were eating not great stuff, right? That, of course, starts to change, just like most of these things, dramatically with the Industrial Revolution. And you see people today are much taller than they used to be. There's an even more kind of sad example. North Koreans, so North and South Korea have been countries for what, 70 years? Since the 50s, right? I mean, two separate countries, right? They used to be one, they were not different in any way. It was one nation, right? Same culture, same everything. The North was actually more developed and industrialized. The South was poor before the division, before the Korean War. And then, just like 40 years later, 50 years later, these are like numbers from the 2000s, the average North Korean was significantly, I don't know by how many inches less tall, shorter, than the average South Korean, because of the kind of food, the bad nutrition that is available in North Korea. So even something that you wouldn't really think about, like height, is something that's been changing. Where we have a hockey stick, and where we're kind of reaping those benefits of living in this kind of time of plenty. Okay, life expectancy. Again, look at this. Where did it start? When did it start to go up? End of the 19th century, and then in the 20th, and now it's all the way up. Okay, homicides. Okay, we're living in safer times than ever. This is in Europe. Okay, this is not all global figures, but look at this. Look at this. Okay, there's less nuclear bombs today than there was at the height of the Cold War. Of course, there's still enough to make us all die, but since the stockpiles, both the Soviet, now the Russian stockpile, and the American stockpiles are significantly lower than they were at their height. And remember, this lowering of this doesn't just happen because the Soviet Union fell apart. This happened as a result also of diplomacy between bitter enemies, ideological enemies like the Soviet Union and the US. They could still sit together and say, okay, our mutual interest is that there's fewer nuclear bombs. We're not going to give them all up, of course, because of this strategy, but And they made it happen. Under Nixon, of all people, the anti-communist warrior. More people live in democracies than ever before. Of course, now we're seeing these kind of problems with stuff going a little bit back, right, in certain places. But still, even with that, more people live in democracy than ever before. These are global deaths in conflict since the year 1400. Okay, so this is the whole thing about war, right? Wars still exist. They're horrible. But war used to be like a fact of life, right? Today, when a war breaks out, even if it's in a country we've never been to, that maybe we have something in common with, or that we know one person from there, or we know even like a celebrity from there, whatever, it feels, very sad, very bad. But for most of history, it was like, oh, there's war again. Oh, I had 5 kids and 4 of them died in the war, and like 1 remains, whatever. And the one that remains will die probably of like some disease, And since World War II, of course, we have had, as you see, okay, the 40s, obviously, the first half of the 40s, we still have World War II. The end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s, we still have the Korean War, stuff like that, blah, blah, blah. But even with Vietnam and all that stuff, which you see a spike in the 60s, even with all of that, worldwide battle deaths per 100,000 people, so per capita, are down. Now, of course, I would like to see these numbers now since, for example, the Ukraine war started, and since this crisis number 567 in the Middle East. But I think even with those numbers, it's nowhere close to what we have been seeing before. Sorry for going so quickly through this. It's about the time. Okay, but now let's look at one more thing before we have a few questions in the Q&A. Public perception of the change in the global extreme poverty. So these are numbers that show people, when people from different countries were asked these questions about, so see, in the last 20 years, the proportion of the world population living in extreme poverty has decreased, increased, or remained the same. And these are percentages of how people answered. Look at Italy, Hungary, France, all these rich, great Western places, and look at those stupid results. Look at, let's take France. 9% of people, by the way, objectively it has decreased. Like, there's no question where this is not a subjective thing. You can't have an opinion on this, right? Only 9% of people in France think that it has decreased. Then we have, what? 23% that think it's the same, and 68% that think it's worse. So people, and then also look at one more thing. Look at the top of that chart. Look at those top 2 countries. China has the most people who say stuff has improved and will continue to improve. Why? Well, because they've seen it, right? Like literally in the last generation, this is just because of like the limited market reforms that they had and the boom that capitalism, that the market or some form of capitalism has created in their country, going from people who were cooking, animals that you would like randomly find in your backyard to a modern society in one generation. See, they are not delusional about this. They see it, but in the West, it's harder for young people to, not just for young people, but like in particular, to kind of notice unless you look at these numbers. So there's a difference between reality and our perception of reality is what I'm trying to say. Public perception of the trend in child mortality. So child mortality has gone down exceptionally in the last decades, and like through the last centuries too, but like the last decades it has really gone down. Look at this. In Senegal, 77% say that it has decreased because they know, because they see that stuff. Because they know that when their grandparents were alive, that it was completely different. How common it was for a child to die of some stupid disease in the first few days of birth or whatever. And they know that today their chances are much lower because of advancements that have been made, because of the vaccines they get, because of whatever, right? But then look at like United States and Japan, Like these are super developed countries, and people just have no connection to the reality of it, right? This is interesting. Optimism about future improvements in global living conditions. Look at this. In Kenya, what's the number? 68% believe that things will get better. Well, because they have probably seen them, no matter how slowly, they have seen things get better. And they know basically that this is not something, you know, a floating abstraction. And then again, same story, don't look at the West, right? Share of the population who think the world is getting better, again, similar thing, look at the highest numbers. Okay, so then what's the deal? We obviously have all of these cognitive biases that I'm not gonna go through now, but this is a really fun poster. You can download in like a really high resolution if you want to like print it out or put it on your wallpaper. And it's pretty cool because it goes through like a bunch of these. Okay, no time for that. I will end on a quote from Dwight Eisenhower, you know, the World War II general and later president of the US, who can, as we can see, both win World War II and slay. And it's a very like short and simple. Pessimism never won any battle. Okay, so we don't have a lot of time for Q&A, but I'll try to get some in. So let's discuss. So what's our problem then? Look at the stuff that's happening. Look at the way people see it. There's obviously a big discrepancy between the perception of how the world is doing and the reality of how the world is doing. So what do we do about it? What's our problem? Let's talk. Or also any other questions, whatever. Yeah, Daniel.
So I think our biggest problem is that in younger generation, to be honest, the people in this room. The thing is that because of the boomers are the biggest generation, have the biggest influence on the policies, it's right now it's basically made for people to much harder get, for example, a new car or a new house, something really basic. And because we see, like in the Western world, people cannot appreciate it on their own, therefore they believe that the problem is everywhere. So, for example, there was a survey, right, to the house price and skyrocketing, and the house is something that leads to happiness, but really correlates with it. The same can be said about cars. It's not a problem of capitalism, to be clear. I mean, it's because of regulations and zoning and everything. So I just want to open up a discussion to say that I think the most people who don't trust in the future, who will live in the future the most, which is us, actually, young people. While generations who are older are much more optimistic about the future, which is quite paradoxical, but that's it. And I think the reason for that are economical, first of all, and it's linked that to psychological, I would say.
Okay, good point, good point. I don't know if I would agree that all previous generations were more optimistic, but definitely, like, you know, in certain generations.
I mean, there's a survey, so like numbers are showing that boomers are still optimists, while millennials and GZ have much lower expectations about the future, and it's even related to our economic decisions. For example, there's a new trend which is called Gen Z deciding not to actually invest money in pension schemes, you know, because they believe that, whatever, I mean, I will just buy, it's actually going to be okay, which is a complete show of how, you know, the future is not bright to them, you know, so they don't even actually rely on it.
True, but it could also be a rational, a result of a rational analysis of the welfare state system, which is not functioning very well, and even in developed countries.
Yeah, the final thing I want to say, like, not to take much to give someone else. There are like 3 predictions made by Mises, sorry for mentioning it here, but I think it's useful in the economic perspective. But one of the falls Soviet Union, another one is Great Depression, and another is the fall of welfare state. And I think right now we kind of introduce our mind to the fall of welfare state because mass doesn't work, right? And there's not enough people to support future pension schemes and solidarity systems and others. So, you know, I'm saying, yeah, I think you're right. I think welfare is just dying and people feel it. And because of that, we're kind of depressed as well, I suppose.
All right.
We should be optimistic about it, actually.
Okay. By the way, says the guy from Ukraine, just saying. So just saying to everyone else, think about your position. Okay, yeah.
Well, I think there's a big illusion in the society right now. Because of the technology, lives are getting better and better. But if you ask for a person from a welfare state, they will tell you that welfare state is burden. But they cannot understand it's not because of the welfare state, it's because of the technology that the people and individuals has been created. And I'm also in the sustainability field. So you're actually right about the nuclear stuff. And most of the people that do not concern that when you're creating solar panels or the hydroelectric centrals or even the wind energy, you need really too high resources, but in the nuclear reactors, you don't have that much resources. So it's also too easy to store that outputs from the nuclear things. And the problems in the Greta's and she's army, army. I think their biggest problem with the capitalism and with the energy companies, because they think only the evil in the world is the fossil company, but they cannot understand the fossil companies is using the products they need and they are wasting.
Exactly.
So they're not sending it to the space. The people that's using it, Greta uses her iPhone, her bus, and that's how we just producing the petrol.
No, absolutely, and we can kind of excuse it because young people don't always. But it's my opinion. If you're a young person who is that active in voicing an opinion about something so concrete and complicated, then you have the duty to be informed about the world, right? If you're just a regular 15-year-old, nobody's going to ask you the detail. But if you are protesting, asking for something, well, you should be informed about what you're talking about. This also reminded me. You said they're not aware of how they think. Evil companies like oil, and then that oil is profit, and that's it. And they don't take into account that oil, if fuel gets more expensive, stuff in their supermarket will get more expensive because the truck that drives the stuff to you has to use fuel. And I mean, I found it. I thought of this example, which is ridiculous, also from Berlin. There was, of course, it's from Berlin, and they were doing street interviews. This was after the Ukraine war started, when the gas prices started to get really high, right? And they were asking this couple who were looked like your ordinary hippie kind of lefty whatever, and they asked them, are you worried about the fuel price increases and how do you think it's going to affect you? And the guy says, oh, we take the train, we don't care. Okay. I mean, I guess I kind of get his point. It's not this, you don't put the same type of fuel in the train like you do in a car. But this connection that you're taking the train, so you're flying? Like this is magic? Like nothing? Just because you don't see a thing with smoke coming out at the end necessarily doesn't mean that, but people don't see, again, in the West, you can live very isolated lives. You don't have to know, you don't have to know what it's like to live in, for example, look at these, and I'll end with this. I think we don't have any more time, but I would love to talk with any of you afterwards, whoever wants to continue, whatever. What was it? Wait. Anyway, yeah, forget it. I'll get to it in one sec. All right, so since they're probably going to decapitate me for already going over my time, I will end this here, but I am more than happy to, for all of those where we started a conversation, didn't finish it, or just want to challenge something I said, or tell me how horribly wrong I am about something, feel free, I'll be around. I'm here until Wednesday. Thank you for your time, and see you around.
Thank you very much for an amazing lecture. Thank you, everyone. We'll be back in half an hour. We'll be having a coffee break as usual here. So we will have fun and see you back in your seats in half an hour. Super. Bravo. Sjajno. Super.
Si zadovoljan? Si ti zadovoljan?
Ja nikad.
To ja je. Full gas.
Pitanje. Hoćeš sada da rečemo ono što treba u tvoju sobu da se nosi?
Da. So yeah, so it's both of you. We can go there and take just I'll show you, come on.
Okay, we can turn off.
Yeah. Jel, možda daš samo ovo snimatelju i kameru? Nisam te čula. Što ovo snimatelju i kameru mene? Da, naravno. Čekaj samo sekund. Bilo je dobro baš. Bilo je dobro baš. Da, baš. dam nekom.
Rešeno.